This outline offers a comprehensive view of tribes and cultures that do not bury their dead. Tribes that do not bury their dead. While there are many tribes that follow unique burial or funeral practices, the reasons behind these practices often involve deep-rooted beliefs, traditions, and values that differ significantly from modern conventions. Below is an outline and structure of a story that explores some tribes that do not bury their dead, the historical context, religious beliefs, and their places of residence. I will also include some book references and video links at the end for deeper exploration. Tribes who don't bury their dead. An exploration of unique funeral practices. Chapter 1. Introduction to Death and Burial Practices. Death is an inevitable part of life, and every culture around the world has devised its own way of dealing with it. While many societies bury their dead as a way of showing respect, others have practices that might seem unusual or even shocking to outsiders. One such practice is the refusal to bury the dead, which can be found in several indigenous tribes. These tribes have their own cultural beliefs, religious practices, and historical reasons for not following conventional burial customs. In this exploration, we will focus on several such tribes, uncovering their unique approaches to death, the reasons behind these practices, and the cultural significance that these rituals hold. Some of the tribes featured include the Toraja of Indonesia, the sky burial tradition of the Tibetan Plateau, and others whose customs involve leaving the dead exposed rather than burying them. Chapter 2. The Toraja of Indonesia. The people who celebrate death. History and location. The Toraja people, indigenous to the mountainous region of South Sulawesi in Indonesia, are well known for their complex and unique funeral practices. The Toraja live in a region called Tanah Toraja, a lush highland area with a rich culture and history. The Toraja have a population of around 1 million people, with many still adhering to traditional beliefs. Burial practices. One of the most remarkable aspects of Toraja culture is their practice of manene, which involves exhuming and cleaning the corpses of deceased ancestors. Toraja people do not bury their dead immediately after death. Instead, the deceased are often kept in their homes or placed in caves or tree coffins, depending on their social status. This process is part of the broader Torajan belief in death as a long and complex journey. Instead of quick burials, Torajans may take months or even years to properly bury their deceased, allowing family members time to prepare for elaborate rituals that mark the passage of the soul. The manene ritual involves the family exhuming the body, cleaning it, and then redressing the deceased before putting them back in their resting place. This practice underscores the belief that death is not an end but a transformation that takes place over a long period. Religious and cultural significance. The Toraja religion, which blends animism with Christianity, shapes their burial practices. In Torajan belief, death is not seen as a singular event but as a stage in an ongoing process. The belief in spirits is central to the culture, and the deceased are thought to watch over their living relatives, offering guidance and protection. By keeping the dead close and caring for them, the living maintain a connection to their ancestors. Chapter 3. The sky burial tradition of Tibet. History and location. Sky burial, or jator, is a funerary practice, most famously associated with the Tibetan Plateau. In this region, the dead are not buried but are instead left exposed on mountaintops or high altitudes to be consumed by vultures and other scavenging birds. This tradition has been practiced for thousands of years and is deeply connected to Tibetan Buddhism, where the body is viewed as a vessel for the soul. Tibet, with its rugged terrain and harsh climate, offers little land for traditional burial practices, which further reinforces the significance of sky burial as an ecological and spiritual practice. Burial practices. In a sky burial, the deceased's body is taken to a high mountain location, where it is dismembered and left for the vultures. This ritual has profound symbolism, as the body is returned to nature in the most direct manner possible. The vultures, which are considered sacred animals in Tibetan culture, represent the idea of the impermanence of life and the cycle of life and death. This practice signifies that in death the body should be given back to the earth and consumed by other life forms. Religious and cultural significance. Sky burial is not just a practical solution for the harsh Tibetan environment but also a deeply spiritual practice. In Tibetan Buddhism, the physical body is seen as an impermanent and transient shell, while the soul continues its journey toward enlightenment. By offering the body to the vultures, the deceased is believed to have their final act of generosity, giving back to nature and helping other beings sustain life. The Tibetan belief in reincarnation also informs this practice, as it is thought that the deceased will be reincarnated in a different form in the cycle of life. Chapter 4. The Ahori of India. The people who embrace death history and location. The Ahori are a small sect of Hindu ascetics who live primarily in the northern regions of India, particularly around Varanasi, the sacred city of death. The Ahori are followers of the god Shiva and are known for their extreme practices, which often include interacting with death in ways that seem macabre to outsiders. While not a tribe in the traditional sense, the Ahori have distinct rituals that defy conventional understandings of burial practices. Burial practices. The Ahori are famous for their practice of cremating the dead, but often using the cremation grounds as places of worship. They do not bury their dead. Instead, they leave the body to be cremated on the banks of the Ganges River or in other sacred cremation grounds. Their rituals may involve using the ashes of the dead for meditation and other practices, symbolizing the impermanence of the physical form and the transcendence of the soul. Religious and cultural significance. Ahori philosophy is rooted in the belief that death is not something to be feared but embraced. They seek to transcend the material world and achieve a direct connection with the divine, particularly the god Shiva, who represents destruction and renewal. In Ahori tradition, rituals involving the dead, such as meditating in cremation grounds or using human skulls as ceremonial cups, a means of confronting the realities of death and attaining spiritual enlightenment. Chapter 5. Other tribes and communities. The Munda tribe of India. The Munda people, an indigenous tribe of India, follow a belief system that rejects conventional burial practices. Instead of burying the dead, the Munda people have been known to expose their deceased in trees or bury them in very shallow graves. This practice reflects their belief in the interconnectedness of life, death, and the natural world. The Malagasy of Madagascar. In Madagascar, the practice of famadihana, or the turning of the bones, is a unique burial tradition. While the dead are initially buried, their bodies are exhumed periodically every few years and rewrapped in new shrouds. This practice allows the living to connect with their ancestors, reintroducing them to the community and ensuring their continued spiritual presence. Chapter 6. Conclusion. The practices of tribes that do not bury their dead are rich with cultural, spiritual, and ecological significance. These tribes, whether through elaborate funeral rituals, such as the Toraja and their Marnane, or through the sky burial practices of Tibet, present an alternative view of death, one that is deeply intertwined with beliefs about the soul, the environment, and the cosmos. These customs force us to reconsider our own perceptions of death and burial, offering a perspective that is both fascinating and thought-provoking. There are still tribes and communities today that maintain unique funeral practices, including those that do not bury their dead or handle death in ways that are different from conventional burial practices. While many of these practices have evolved over time or been influenced by modern religions and technologies, some tribes continue to follow ancient traditions that involve exposure to the elements or rituals that do not include burial in the ground. Here are some examples of tribes and communities that still practice such customs. 1. The Toraja people of Indonesia. As mentioned earlier, the Toraja people of South Sulawesi, Indonesia, are famous for their elaborate and unique death rituals. Their practice of keeping the deceased at home for extended periods before burial, and the Marnane, exhuming and cleaning the bodies of deceased ancestors, is still practiced today. In some parts of their community, although the traditional practices are facing pressure from modernity and religion, the Toraja continue to honor the deceased through these profound rituals. 2. The Tibetan sky burial. Sky burial is a centuries-old practice, followed in parts of Tibet and the surrounding regions of the Tibetan plateau, where the dead are not buried but are left exposed to scavenger birds, especially vultures. The practice is still followed today, particularly in rural Tibet and among Tibetan Buddhists. It is considered an act of generosity, returning the body to nature, as well as a way of preparing the soul for reincarnation. the tradition remains strong despite modern pressures. 3. The Ahori of India. The Ahori are a small sect of Hindu ascetics, many of whom live in Varanasi, India. They have extreme rituals associated with death and may use cremation grounds for spiritual practices. Although they primarily follow the custom of cremation, they often engage with the remains of the dead in ways that are considered unconventional and extreme by mainstream society. The Ahori focus on overcoming the fear of death and may engage in practices such as meditating among dead bodies or using human skulls in their rituals. 4. The Malagasy people of Madagascar, Famadihana. The Malagasy people of Madagascar follow a fascinating practice known as Famadihana, or the turning of the bones. While the dead are buried initially, the bodies are exhumed every few years to be rewrapped in fresh shrouds, celebrated, and paraded around by the living. This ritual allows families to connect with their ancestors and ensure that they continue to have a spiritual presence in the family. The practice remains a strong tradition in many parts of Madagascar today. 5. The Nabe Bugle of Panama and Costa Rica. This indigenous group, found in parts of Panama and Costa Rica, follows a tradition where the bodies of the deceased are sometimes left exposed in the open, often in tree branches or placed on platforms in the forest. The Nabe Bugle believe that leaving the body exposed allows the spirit to pass on to the afterlife more easily. Although this practice is less common today due to the influence of Christianity and modernization, it persists in some remote areas. 6. The Munda tribe of India. The Munda tribe, native to central and eastern India, has historically practiced unique ways of disposing of their dead, such as leaving bodies exposed or placing them in shallow graves. The Munda follow a mixture of animism and Hinduism, and their death rituals are closely tied to their beliefs in the afterlife and the connection between the living and the dead. Though some aspects of their culture have changed, these traditions are still observed in more rural or isolated Munda communities. 7. The Dani people of Papua New Guinea. The Dani tribe, native to the highlands of Papua New Guinea, traditionally practiced exposure of the dead. After death, the body would often be placed in a tree or another elevated structure as a way of ensuring the spirit's transition to the afterlife. The Dani, particularly in remote villages, continue to follow some of these traditions, though the practice is becoming less common due to external religious influences. 8. The Yanomami tribe of Brazil and Venezuela. The Yanomami, one of the largest indigenous tribes in the Amazon rainforest, have a traditional practice that involves the exposure of the dead. The body of a deceased Yanomami is often burned or cremated in a ritual fire. This practice is a form of returning the body to the earth and spirit world, ensuring that the soul passes to the afterlife in accordance with their beliefs. While this custom is now influenced by missionary activity and modernization, aspects of the traditional rituals are still observed in more isolated Yanomami communities. Why do these practices persist? The reasons why these practices persist are multifaceted. Cultural identity. These rituals are deeply embedded in the cultural identity of these communities, and death is seen as a continuation of life rather than an end. For many, such practices serve to maintain a connection with ancestors and the spiritual world. Religious beliefs. Many of these practices are directly linked to the tribe's religious beliefs. For example, Tibetan Buddhists believe that sky burial helps the soul in its transition to the next life, and the Toraja believe in the importance of allowing the soul time to transition and reach its final resting place. Ecological practices. In some cases, such as in Tibet and among the Ahori, death rituals are designed to harmonize with nature. Sky burial, for instance, is seen as a way to return the body to the earth and animals, while the Toraja's practice of keeping the body in the home reflects their connection to the land and their ancestors. Isolation and tradition. Tribes living in remote areas are often less affected by outside influences, allowing them to continue their ancient customs. These rituals become a way of maintaining their way of life in a rapidly changing world. While the majority of the world's population follows conventional burial customs, these tribes offer a glimpse into a world where death is seen through a different lens. The refusal to bury the dead in favor of practices like exposure to the elements, dismemberment, or ritual exhumation may seem shocking, But for these communities, such rituals hold deep spiritual, cultural, and ecological significance. As globalization and modernization continue to influence these traditional ways of life, many of these practices are at risk of disappearing. However, as long as these tribes maintain their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs, these fascinating rituals are likely to continue in some form, providing a window into humanity's diverse and evolving relationship with death. If you're interested in learning more about these tribes and their practices, there are books, documentaries, and other resources that delve deeper into their funeral rituals and spiritual beliefs. References for further reading: books, The Toraja of South Sulawesi, A Study of Culture and Ritual by SSHJ Evers, Tibet Sacred Sky. Burials by Mark U. Edwards, Death and Afterlife, The Cultural Roots of Beliefs About Survival After Death by Robert L. McKinney.